Let's take a look at the music editor within Studio One 3. Now the music editor is going to be for when we're working with our instrument parts or MIDI parts that we have here. I've got two instrument tracks with MIDI parts contained within them, and these are going to be open for editing in the editor. We also have the audio editor for when we're working with audio events, and these two are going to provide us different controls when we're working with either one. So if I have this audio track selected and open up the editor, then we can see the various controls that are available to us here. Now if I go ahead and select a instrument track, then we can see that the controls that are going to be available to us are significantly different here. And this is what we're going to focus on in this video. If you'd like to see working with the audio editor, then go ahead and click on this link up here in the corner. Now, in order to access the editor, we have several different ways we can do that when we're working with our MIDI. We can come up to our MIDI part and just double click. We can also press F2 on our keyboard. While a MIDI part or MIDI event is selected, we can also click the edit button down below. We can also come up to View and select the editor here. Now this is going to be a two-part series for working with the music editor, and in this part one we're going to cover basically what are the controls that we can use to see what we want to see, arrange things how we'd like to see them, as well as an overview of the different controls or functions that we have available to us here. In part two we're going to take a look at editing and some of the deeper features that are contained. So to start, let's just take a look at how we can set it up, how we would like to view it to help with our particular way of working. And to start, just know that we can click this arrow here to detach that editor, and it's defaulted to a maximized mode because that's how I last had it open. We can click this restore and then have a smaller window that we could resize how we'd like. We could also drag this to a additional monitor or a second monitor if we have one, and then maximize it in that monitor as well. That will really give us a good view of what we're doing when we're editing our MIDI. To return it back to its attached state, we can just click this down arrow. We can make use of our zoom functions or shortcut keys within the editor as well. So if I press W, we can zoom out. If I press E, then we can really zoom in here. We can also make use of the ruler. So if I click and drag, click, hold, and drag down, then we zoom out, and dragging up, we'll zoom out by dragging up and zoom in by dragging down. We can then move to the left or right while we're still holding to change the view horizontally. We also have vertical zoom, and we can just hold down Shift and E to zoom in vertically, or Shift and W to zoom out. We also have a slider here down at the bottom, so if I click and hold and drag up or down, we can zoom in or out this way as well. And this is basically going to affect the piano roll area only, or the drum mat if we have that selected. Now I'm working on a small laptop monitor, so my resolution is pretty low, so things are pretty crammed in here. If you have a larger monitor and you're working with a higher resolution like 1920 by 1080, then you're going to see a lot more here. But this is part of the reason why we're talking about these controls, to alter the view, because many of us are working on a laptop and our real estate is limited. So with that in mind, just know that we can come here to this border and then drag up or down to control the view in relation to our piano roll and our part automation lane down below here. And in the part automation lane, this is where we can access our velocity settings, our modulation, pitch bend, aftertouch, and really add and edit our automation in this lane. We can also right click on one of these tabs and add an additional parameter to be automated. We can also click here on this icon. And so while I have, actually let me close out, and I'm going to select the piano track here and come back to add a parameter. Let's say if I want to add an automation lane for the LFO and the frequency, then I can just add that, close out, and now we can see that we have frequency here, and I can bring up the Paint tool, draw in some automation, and we've got that done really quickly. In order to remove that, then I can just right click on that frequency tab and remove. We can also work with two different parameters at the same time if we'd like as far as automation is concerned. So down below we have these two icons. If I click this second one, then I can add an additional lane, select another tab, say the pitch bend here, and then we can work with the automation for two different parameters in relation to one another. To remove that additional lane, we would just toggle that and click again. And we could also, to save real estate, if we're not going to be working with automation or velocity adjustments, we can click this first one to remove that lane. And now we've got a larger view of our piano roll or the drum map if we're working with that. And I'm going to go ahead and add that lane back in just so we can stick with what most of us are probably seeing. And with this back on, just know that we can also scroll here vertically using this scroll bar to the right, and we can also scroll horizontally by clicking down below here. Moving on, at the very top in the left hand corner we have a link track selection that we can toggle on and off, and for the life of me I can't figure out what this is for and what it does, what its function is, and I haven't seen anything in the manual for this. So if you are watching this and you know what this does, please leave a comment below for the rest of us to know. Next to that, we have a track list that we can open up, and within this panel we can see the instrument tracks that we have available to edit, and we can select those. Right now we've got the piano, which has a presence on it, and by clicking this white circle here we can hide that MIDI data from view or kind of deactivate this channel. I'll go ahead and click that to turn it back on. We can select the battery device here to make that active as well and visible. So I can scroll down and then we can see the MIDI data that is on our battery track. Now, even though these are both being shown here, we cannot edit the MIDI data for the presence or the piano part. These are then grayed out, and this is because we have this edit icon or this pencil icon. Whenever this is highlighted in blue, then that's when we can edit that information. So right now our battery track is blue, so these MIDI notes are now active for editing. If I were to scroll up to our piano part and then deselect that edit for the battery and then make it active for our piano, we can then come in and make edits to these MIDI notes. And for now I'm going to go ahead and hide that battery track and close out our track list. Below those items we have a color palette that's available to us, and we can click this, and this will change the color of our track, our console channel, our notes. So if I come over to this red, then our notes will change, our MIDI part will change in the arranged view, as well as our track. If I bring up the console here, then we can see that that has changed as well. And I'll F2 to come back to the editor, and I'm actually just going to put this back to as it was. We then have a drop-down menu here where we can select one of our instrument tracks by clicking. As we've seen in this video, we can also choose between the piano roll or the drum map here by clicking these two icons. And then next to or below that we have an icon here where we can open up our instrument for editing different parameters if we'd like to do that. We can click again to hide. We have mute, solo. We can audition notes. So with this checked, then I can click on this keyboard. If I unmute the piano and audition the notes for the particular VST instrument that we're working with. If I go ahead and deselect, then it's still auditioning. So let's see. So I double clicked and added that in and we had no sound. If I come back and check that, okay, so the audition notes is for when we're adding. So let me undo that and then uncheck audition. Okay. So I'm glad I caught that. I'll just select those and delete that out. I'll go ahead and check the box back. In this center area, we have some tools for when we're editing, and we're going to cover that in depth in part 2 when we go into editing our MIDI data. Below that, we have an inspector area here. So if I go ahead and select a MIDI note, then we can see that this is populated with fields where we can adjust the start, end, length, pitch, velocity, and mute for our selected note, or we could select a group of notes and make adjustments. So if I wanted to change the start of the note or the end or the length, then I could just double click and manually enter in a value. Maybe a simpler way to do this, or another way to do this would be, say if we wanted to change the length. Right now this is at 1 bar. If I just hover and use my mouse wheel, then I can change that. And changing the start, if I hover over this and use the mouse wheel, I can change that like so. Of course, we could come in with the arrow tool selected and drag. We can change the pitch by clicking and manually entering in a value. We could also click on this down arrow and access a menu here to choose a different pitch as well. Now if I select the velocity tab down here, we can change the velocity of our note by using our mouse wheel. So while that note is selected, if I go ahead and scroll with my mouse wheel, we can see that below here in our parameter automation lane, that velocity information is changing. And if I just click and put in 80, then we return back to as it was. Checking the mute box will just mute that individual note that I have selected, or it will mute a group of notes if you have a group of notes selected. Moving back to the top of the editor, we have our tools, and we'll cover in depth what each one of these can do within the music editor in part 2. We'll just do a brief overview at the moment with the arrow tool. Of course, we can drag up or down and move left or right within our timeline. We can click, hold, and select a group of notes. We can change the length. And we can even double click to enter notes and just double click to delete them out. And we can access that arrow tool by pressing number 1 on our keyboard. Number 2 will give us the split tool, and we can use that to split our notes. Notice that we have these crosshairs that appear when we select the split tool. So that bottom line is basically going to display beneath the note the pitch that we're going to be cutting, and the vertical line will show the exact position of the cut that we're going to make. And of course, this is going to be influenced, this vertical line is going to be influenced by whatever our quantized value is set to. So right now I've got mine set to quarter notes. So you can see that this jumps by quarter notes as I move left or right here. If you don't want that to happen, then you can just turn the snap to grid off, and then now you can see that that freely moves about. I'll go ahead and turn that back on. We can also press in on our keyboard to toggle the snap function on and off. So if I come down and position the horizontal crosshair below this G2 note, and then position the vertical crosshair here, go ahead and click, then we have a cut. I'll bring up the arrow tool, and we can see that we now have 2 individual notes created from the one. And I'll Control Z to undo that. Now pressing 3 will give us the paint tool, and we can use this to draw in notes. If we click once, then we have a note that will be added, and its length will be set to whatever we have our quantized value set to. So if I change this to a whole bar, then we can see that the note length will be adjusted accordingly. While the paint tool is active, as with the arrow tool, we can come in to the end of a note and drag to change its length. And I believe that our snap value is actually going to affect our note length as well when we're doing that. So if I were to change this to back to quarter note, and if you notice that these notes are jumping, it's because we have this auto quantize on. So if you don't want that to happen when you're working with your edits, be sure that you disable the auto quantize here. But if I now come back, we still have the paint tool active, and we've changed the quarter notes. If I drag, that is snapping to the quarter. So as with most of the tools that we're using, our quantized value, as long as snap to grid is on, is going to play a part in what we're doing. Now next we have the erase tool, and we can access that by pressing 4, and I'll go ahead and erase these notes that I created. We can click, or we can click, hold, and drag and release notes in that way as well. Next we have the mute tool, which we can access by pressing 5 on our keyboard, and we can click on a individual note to mute that. We could also click, hold, and drag to select a group of notes. And if we click, hold, and drag again, that will unmute them. And finally, for the tools, by pressing 6, we can access the listen tool. So if I come back to the beginning of this MIDI part here and click and hold, it will solo the particular track that we're working with in relation to the other ones in our song and play back wherever we start, wherever we click from. So if I start from here, or, and that is the listen tool. And I'm going to press 1 and bring back the arrow tool, and let's move on to cover the rest of the items here. We've got access to the quantized panel, and covering this is a bit beyond the scope of this video, as well as these other two, the macros panel and the step record panel, but just know that you can access those there. We'd be here for a few hours if we were to try to cover those in this one video. We then have an area for quickly accessing different functions when we're working with our MIDI. So if we click this, we can see a variety of different editing functions that we can access here. And this is going to be accessible in a couple other places, and it's similar to if we were to select our MIDI part in the arrange view and then right click and come to the musical functions. If you notice, these are the exact same features that we saw in that drop down menu. Now if I were to come back to our piano part, select a note, and then right click, then we can see the musical functions. These are available in this manner as well. And we'll take a closer look at some of those functions contained within these menus in part 2. Next we have our quantize, time base, and snap settings, and we've kind of touched on these in this video already. The quantize is, you can basically set your quantize value here, and if you do any quantization, it's going to use this value. And as we've also seen, if you are working with any of the tools, then they're going to be influenced by whatever we have set here, as long as you have the snap to grid active. Our time base is going to affect our ruler and what sort of time base we're working in. Right now we have bars selected, so we're showing bars in our ruler. If we were to click this drop down menu and choose seconds, we can see that this then adjusts and shows seconds. We can choose samples, and we also have frames available. I'm going to come back to our bars. And lastly, we have this snap here, and it's set to quantize. So the snapping feature that we have seen in our tools is going to be influenced by this here. And if I press 2 and bring up the split tool, we can see that this is jumping or snapping by quarter notes as we have set here, because this is set to quantize. If I were to change this to adaptive, then we can see it's still jumping by quarter notes. But if I were to zoom out, then this is jumping by bar now. And that's what that adaptive does. It's going to basically take into consideration what your zoom level is and affect the snap based on that. So if I click and zoom back in, then we can see now it's back to that quarter note snapping. The other option that we have available is choosing bar, and if we choose that, then you can see it's snapping by bar. And so this is going to disregard whatever we have set here in our quantized value. I'm going to go ahead and change this to adaptive. And the last two items that we're going to cover are the snap to grid, and we've already covered that. So our auto scroll is the last feature, and this will be incredibly helpful if you are working with editing your MIDI, and especially if you're new to Studio One and you've tried to do some editing and you find that this keeps jumping around when you're playing back. The auto scroll is going to disable that. So let me come to our arrange view, and I'm going to press D and duplicate that piano part over a few more bars, and let me turn the loop function off, and I'm going to play solo and play back this piano part. And now, right now the auto scroll is turned off, so wherever we've focused our editing at, we're going to remain there. If I press F on my keyboard, note that this will highlight and the screen will jump to the cursor position. And from this point on, while the auto scroll is active, the edit screen is going to follow along with that song cursor. If I press F and turn it off, then we remain where we are. So that's going to be useful for you when you're doing editing, because it can be pretty frustrating if you're trying to work with one specific part and it keeps changing on you. Okay, so I think we will end here, and then in part 2 we're going to take a closer look at all the different ways that we can edit our MIDI data, as well as the automation parameter lane down below and this center section here, and just basically how we can work with our editing of MIDI a lot quicker, and what are the tools that are available to us to get things done in a much quicker way.